Well, hello, welcome to Winepilot. My name is Angus Hewson. Today, it's our really great pleasure to welcome a couple of the Henschke family to join us. And one of the most historic winemaking families in Australia, celebrated 150 years of winemaking in 2018, and now it's the fifth generation and sixth generation now of winemaking, viticultural and marketing team. Today we are joined by a handful of people from the Winepilot team. So we have Andrea Pritzker, Master of Wine, founder of Wine Intuition in Sydney. We have Jenny Port, award-winning wine writer from Melbourne. Simon Kirkovich, award-winning sommelier from Cafe Sydney in Sydney. And Melissa Moore from Maryvale, sommelier, and also runs the bottle shop at the Royal Hotel. So look, thanks so much for all being here. Stephen, and Justine, some of these people came to my house yesterday. We tasted the wines in a fairly casual kind of atmosphere, but we're all really impressed by what we saw. Not just the wines we're going to taste today. We really enjoyed it. And the reason why we are here today is in a month's time-ish, the new releases of obviously Henschke single vineyard wines come out. And it's really one of the biggest days in the Australian, I think, wine calendar is when those wines come out. And that's the 5th of May in 2021. And I mean, I tell people this story quite a bit. Some of us have, been lucky enough, Stephen and Justine, we've been with you, on a coolish April day where we've got to taste these wines with you personally. And for me personally, I love it because it is just so clear how much these wines mean to you personally. I think we taste a lot of wines, and I think Jenny would agree that it's really, the air is really heavy with emotion during these events because it clearly just means so much to you. So I guess tell us why is Hill of Grace does it mean so much to you?
Good question. I guess because it's more than just a vineyard. It's just not a bunch of old vines. This is a family history story. And the fact that those old vines now, sort of over 160 years old, are still there in the vineyard. They're still producing fantastic quality fruit. I've just come back from the vineyard, walking through, tasting the berries this morning. And it's for me, it's a very an emotional experience because my 5 generations of Henschkes have been involved, going back to the Stanitskys and then through my grandmother, who was a Stanitsky and married my grandfather. So the connection is really strong. It's at the local church where it's got its name. The Hill of Grace isn't a hill, it's actually a little valley. Very Australian, it's the opposite. The name comes from the church. And that history of the Silesian Lutherans who were persecuted in the 1830s, 1840s in Silesia, Brandenburg, Posen, in Prussia, came and settled in Australia. And I guess the contribution that they gave, and including with my family in all sorts of fields of not just growing grapes and farming, but also art and music and sculpturing and all those sorts of things. So for us, I think it's the whole vineyard and story of Hill of Grace. The single vineyard rotates around all those lovely connections with the family, with the church, with the music and the whole process. So that vineyard has been sitting at church watching, the generations of Henschkes getting born and married and having children and passing away, and there's all of that sort of process. Brings back memories for me as a young kid growing up, hearing the trumpets playing with the organ and singing carols and dressing up like Justine did as Mary or Joseph, and all that sort of stuff is it's just intertwined with what this vineyard's all about. But the also the other amazing thing is the impact that the fruit from this vineyard makes on us each year. There are years like last year where, you know, we picked just a few bunches off the whole vineyard. This year it has a lovely average crop again. I think, you know, there's always that emotional sensation as I guess a farmer in a way, because, you know, looking after a vineyard, you're a farmer, viticulturist. But that whole aspect of what Mother Nature allows you to have each year that you have to work with, and the variation of the seasons can be quite challenging, but it can also be a huge amount of fun. And to think that we've had 4 magnificent vintages in a row, 15, 16, 17, 18. And 16 is one of the highlights. 15 was an absolute highlight last year. As you know, it was just an absolute classic vintage. It's lovely to look at the data and work out why. But the 16 vintage was another one of those heaven-sent vintages, I guess you could say. And the old ancients, you know, performed really well. And we had beautiful maturity, beautiful bright flavors, you know, lovely, fresh, vibrant wines that are just delicious and will be for the next 20, 30, 40 vintages, you know, years onwards. So it's a really wonderful feeling when you get a good vintage like that, because you know that really special little plot of soil and vines provides, you know, excitement, not just for us. It's wonderful hearing from other people, you know, like yourselves, and talking about it, because that gives us that really special knowledge that this vineyard is cherished by other people because of the wines it produces.
And I mean, Justine, how does it fit in? How does it fit in for you? Is there a different kind of experience, or is it at all, or is it fairly similar?
Yeah, I think it's quite similar. That you follow this vineyard for its sense of place, and then to be able to line up the different vintages and compare and contrast. That's the beauty of single vineyard. And usually we would release Hill of Grace every May, and it's worked out beautifully that we're able to release the 2016 Mount Edelstone at the same time, so that we can look at the same vintage, but these 2 separate sites. And they're not that far away from each other, but they're on quite different aspects. They both have quite ancient vines, but then the aroma characteristics and their hallmark spice that we get from those 2 wines are always so distinctive. So it's nice to be contrasting those 2 wines this release, and being able to compare the same vintage. For a change, it doesn't always line up that way. And then to be releasing 16 Hill of Roses as well, and then to look at that play between old vine and young vine, and this Hill of Roses being nursery vines, cuttings that we took, or that Mum took and planted in '89, to be able to future-proof for future generations. Then we can look at the Hill of Roses block and try to work out at what point are these vines going to qualify for Hill of Grace. So yeah, I think there's lots of interesting takeaways from looking at these wines today.
I think there was a fantastic interplay between those 3 wines. I agree. It was fascinating to see. We don't often get that opportunity, obviously. And it was fascinating. The Hill of Roses, I think I'm sure we'll talk about that in a bit in a moment. But just before we get into the wines, I guess one thing it's worth talking about, that, you know, the history of Mount Edelstone at the same time. Like, really, in some ways, that's the most historic. Hello, Prue.
Look who's here.
How's the dog?
Not well.
I'm sorry.
Never mind, yes. She's at the next one.
Well, we hope the dog is better soon.
I think so. Yeah.
So just we're just talking about, I guess, Edelstone and how it fits into the fabric of Henschke as the you know, the first single vineyard wine within the range. I mean, how does it sit for you in importance, I guess?
Well, I guess it's a bigger vineyard. So I guess it plays a more important role to spread to the market, whereas Hill of Grace is very tiny and it's a high-end consumer who can afford it. And then Mount Edelston, we've got, what, 40 acres, so it's 4 times as big. And yeah.
But still, you know, quite ancient vines,
Oh, yeah.
and low yields. But I guess that's where you've done a lot of your research work too. In that.
Yes, so I think working with old vines is certainly a really rewarding thing, and it flies in the face of all this old vines need to die sort of syndrome that goes on. So we're really preserving those old vines by putting them up on decent trellises, really training our pruners to be the best pruning, or using the best pruning technique, which is this Simonette and search technique. And I think we can see, apart from Poor Set, we can see that vineyard carries quite a good yield. So yeah, it's a marketable quantity compared to Hill of Grace.
Yeah, and a special patch of dirt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in terms of, I mean, Stephen, obviously Prue's 40 years, essentially, you know, working very closely with you, that organic biodynamic. How much impact do you think that having on, if you hadn't gone down that road, where the wines would be today and where they are today, essentially?
Yeah, I'd question whether they would have survived a lot of those more drastic seasons, because I think the whole mulching, everybody knows now that mulching under vine has been a godsend to dry grown vineyards, and it's also helped with that. It's sort of eased the vines through those really hot periods. So there's definitely cooler under vine zone. And I think there are lots of examples where people have measured under vine into dirt on a hot day and been quite surprised how much cooler it is with mulching. So it's a more even sort of environment, less stressful.
And I think, you know, the decade or two of work in that area as Prue's built up the organic matter in the vineyard, I think has played a big role in keeping those vines healthy. Shiraz can be incredibly vigorous. Even 150-year-old Shiraz can be amazingly vigorous.
Most vigorous patch on Hill of Grace is actually a grandfather's.
So, you know, all that work that was done, you know, that Prue was involved in back in the late 70s, early 80s with canopy management and whatever, sunlight into wine effectively, has played a big role in you know, good exposure, good colour, good flavour, good tannin maturity. And I think it's probably strengthened the wine's sense of place. You know, Mount Edelston is incredibly distinctive in terms of its Eden Valleyness, that sage pepper character. It's probably still the most, I guess, most, you know, typical Eden Valley vineyard wine, and it has been for over 60 years, since my father first bottled it in 1952. So I think, you know, by putting better exposure, by keeping those vines healthier, particularly in the drier seasons, has really paid dividends and can maintain the consistency of quality and flavour from the vineyard.
So today we're going to talk about 4 different wines, but from 2 different vintages, from obviously 2018 and 2016. How do you see those 2 years? I mean, obviously you're a fan of both the years, but what are the similarities? What are the differences?
In a way, they're probably more similar than they are different. They're both warmer years. 16 started off as a drought vintage, and went into a relatively dry spring, but we had good flower set, good flowering. We had very little frost or damage or anything like that. Summer was reasonably dry as well. We had a bit of heat in December, but after that it tailed off, and then we had rain at Veraison. So that rain at Veraison time plays a big role in, and it seems to be characteristic for South Australia, and it fits into the physiology of those old dry-grown vines, being able to get moisture at the times it physiologically needs it the most. And at obviously around springtime you need it, and you need it at Veraison time for ripening fruit up. And that happened, and then we had a bit of rain again in March, and so we actually set up the season really well. In 16, for these wines, we had beautiful ripeness and beautiful flavours. 18 started off differently because it was a wetter season to start off the vintage of 18. But once again, we had quite good set. We had, quite even sort of summer. We had some heat through summer, but we didn't have anything that caused any damage. And most damage really will happen closer to ripening. So if you have a few major heat events before then, it doesn't really detract from the quality of the fruit. It's that final ripening period that plays a huge role. And I think that's one of the beauties about Eden Valley, where a couple of weeks later, with our whole season, so it pushes us back into a later period in autumn of ripening. So that's why we're picking at, most of the Barossa guys are finished by Easter. We're just starting to pick Hill of Grace and Mount Edelson at Easter. And we've got cold, dewy mornings. This morning was this foggy, cold, sort of dewy morning. And it's turned into gorgeous, sunny, it's almost like spring, but it's autumn day. And these that sort of weather during our autumn for ripening is sensational, and it happened in 18 as well. So we got beautiful, ripe, mature flavours in it. In the end, it's about what it looks like in the glass, isn't it? So,
I think that's the perfect time to, talk about that 2018, the Tapa Pass, obviously. So it's a blend. It's a Eden Barossa blend, isn't it?
Yeah. So what happened
is,
so what happened really is, I guess the Barossa is quite unique in its socio-economic settlement, and then ongoing connections right through to our generation and Justine's generation. My grandfather was getting these same grapes, but as younger vines, then my father, and now me. And those vines were planted sort of back in the 40s and 50s. So now they've got a reasonable amount of age on them. And I guess from that perspective, you're looking at flavours of the part of the Mount Lofty Ranges that is different to where we are with Hill of Grace and Mount Edelson. So we're in that sedimentary metamorphosed, that's the word I was looking for, metamorphosed silts that were laid down sort of in the seabed bottom part of the continent, metamorphosed under enormous pressures about 500 million years ago, and then tilted up into the Mount Lofty Ranges. But there's a part of the Mount Lofty Ranges on the western side that has a limestone ridge running along, and there's still discussion about the origin of that, whether it was reefs or whether it was just calcareous formation. And that's where my great uncle Julius obtained his marble for carving the angels in the cemetery, and the War Memorial in the North Terrace, for example, his most famous work. But the vineyards that are on that produce a totally different flavour. So when you smell and taste Tapa Pass, you see the blue fruits is not the spicy sage characters of Mount Edelston or the pepper. It's much more sort of floral and pretty, and those blue fruits really dominate. What's interesting was that we had two vineyards. We had one vineyard which is at Tupper Pass, right on top of this limestone and red clay loam over the top, and that's sort of like a terra rossa overlooking the Barossa, and that soil is just quite extraordinary, and really beautiful flavours, and it's basically on a north-facing slope, and there's really beautiful red soil. But on the edge of the range, as you get into the foothills of the range, another vineyard planted by my uncle Jack Barch. So Uncle Jack's vineyard, goes back to the 50s, and we call it the Shandy Block. That's sort of its nickname. And that block is on the same soil, but the tumbled down version. So it's a mixed up version of the red loam and the limestone. It's just the most amazing soil. And so we had these two vineyards, and they belong so well together because they're separated by sort of 150 to 200 meters in altitude. They both have a similarity in their sort of flavors. So Uncle Jack's is a slightly sort of bigger, riper version of the Tupper Pass. He's in Lights Pass, and so you have that combination. And so we decided we would put them together, and that became then the Tupper Pass wine.
And as the crow flies, how close are they?
There would be less than a kilometre.
Right.
Yeah, yes,
Yeah.
just down the hill.
So one's literally looking over the other.
Right.
But they just, with our trialing and blending, they just seem to suit each other so well. They're better sum of the parts than separate, interestingly. And we started this in 2002. Although the fruit had been coming into the winery for years, 2002 was a vintage like we're having this year, 2021. It was an inspirational vintage because it's incredibly cold summer, colder than we've been wearing jumpers this summer, but that was actually a colder summer. Prue and I were on holidays down sort of near the Murray Mouth, and we were wearing our wetsuits during the day. It was so cold. And that was in January.
Love it. So, Jenny Ford, what do you think of the Tupper Pass?
I was thrilled with this wine. It was the first wine I opened. I just love that gorgeous fruit exuberance that comes through on the aromas. Just utterly delightful. And those black fruits, red licorice, blueberry. I'm glad I got that right, Stephen, the blueberry notes. A touch of confection too. It's kind of wine gummy, kind of pastel-y. There is a confection note anyway for me. And then that linear, fine-edged palate, silky tannins, and a powerful core, getting back to that fruit quality of succulent, sweet-hearted fruit spice. Oak is present, but there is no reliance on it. I find that's your stamp anyway, your hallmark. And then finally, like velvet on the tongue, boasting wonderful length. It's just one of those wines you want to cuddle and you want to have more than one glass, which is always a good sign.
No, thank you. There's lovely words, lovely description.
How about you, Andrea?
Yeah, I have many similar comments to Jenny. Certainly a fuller, richer body, which you expect, particularly with some Barossa in the mix there. So, and your comments, Stephen, about where the vineyards are, that makes a lot of sense in terms of the power that you see in this wine. Lots of beautiful dock, cherry, blackberry fruit alongside some of those blue fruit notes. But beautifully balanced. And to Jenny's point, I think the oak is there, but it's in check, which I think is the Henschke signature as well. Just wonderful elongated palate and allowing the fruit to shine through.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Kirkovich?
Yeah, I would agree with both Jenny and Andrea there. For me, it's really the lusciousness of the blue fruits, the blueberries, the boysenberry, underscored by that really rich and dense notes of blackberries, black cherries, leading into some plum skin. There is that, for me, there was that edginess to the fruit, which is very typical of Barossa. But then it's that luscious velvet tannin structure, the way the oak supports that for me, which it's just such a harmonious wine. And that length in the palate is just wonderful. Really is. The tail length of the flavour is really fantastic. And, you know, for me, when a wine is fantastic, it's the way it finishes on the palate. There's no bitterness, there's no excessive sweetness. It's just a wonderful experience from entry all the way through to the end. It's a wonderful wine.
Thank you.
You, Melissa?
Oh, I have to agree with everybody. For me, I loved the almost Black Forest Gatto fruit weight, juiciness, a little bit of chocolate, and then the palate I find and very similar to all the bracket, where just the creaminess of the texture. The texture for me was just so delicious, and you know, it was that beautiful ripe fruit, but also a savoury character too that I loved about the wine. Yeah, it was wonderful.
I mean, I think that it has a really important, we're talking about this fleshy kind of ripe style. It's a fleshy ripe style for Henschke rather than it being a fleshy ripe style for the Barossa. And I think yes, it was the fleshiest of the wines, but at the same time, it was still in that fairly typical Henschke, understated, you know, extended time in oak, you know, gentle kind of handling. You know, I thought that absolutely came through. We now moved to 2016, and I think the Mount Edelstone, which was a really fascinating wine because I think we opened it yesterday at about 1 o'clock or 12 o'clock or something, and I had a little taste at like 8 o'clock last night, and it had really changed. I would have liked to have shared it with everybody, but it really changed quite a lot in the glass. Simon, how did you see that wine?
Yeah, it was tasting it at a half-hour interval where I had access to the wine. It's almost still a tale of two wines, and that's not because it oxidized or anything like that. It was just, for me, quite a typical austere nature to Edelstone upon opening, and then it evolves in the glass to something really luscious and with this, you know, delicious black fruit character. Just a touch of eucalypt from the start, which then moves into an olivaceous character, and then you have that lovely tannin structure again, which just enhances some of the spice character. The alcohol is never overwhelming, and it's just such a well balanced in check wine again. I think for me, what typifies your wines always is that balance and harmony, which so many other wineries just can't really achieve.
What about you, Jenny? You've seen the odd bottle of Mount Edelstone in your time?
I have. I'd like to concentrate on one thing and maybe get your response there, Stephen and Prue, and that is it is deadly concentrated. I mean, that's goes without saying to a degree, that is part of the style. But is this sustained tannin push that I thought marked this vintage possibly more than previous vintages? I could be wrong. And it is that degree of tannin that leads me directly to the cellar with this wine. I would not be broaching this wine for some time to come. And again, it is assured, I should say, of a long life, but it is a slightly different Mount Edelstone for me, and maybe my memory's failing, but for me it is in a different level, and it is because of that concentration in tannin, I think. What's your feeling, can I ask?
That's a good observation. We've been sort of thinking and talking about this as well, because I guess, you know, from the 15 vintage, which was an absolute classic vintage, the 16 has, you know, we're looking at the way the season went, because, you know, the wine is really a snapshot of what that season was like. And Mount Edelstone, you know, over those 60 years has sort of been going along this line of different types of vintages, but it always has that sage pepper characteristic, the dark fruits. And sort of, it has some red fruits that go in and out, depending on the season as well. But it's got that Eden Valleyness. It's got that Eden Valleyness in terms of its acid profile and in terms of its really fine velvety tannin profile. But this, in the 16, we think that because of the drier season to start with, coming through winter and spring, we even though we had quite a good average crop on the vines, they seem to be smaller berries. And the smaller berries plays into what you've just said, Jenny, where I think you get, it's a volume to skin ratio, to surface area ratio, and we just had naturally that little bit more concentration, that darker colour with more skin effect, and also the greater tannin effect. Because what we're making is all from the vineyard. Everything that Prue does is what ends up in the wine, other than the oak that we're using maturing the wine. We don't do anything else to it. So these are just the natural tannins, but I think for us, what's really critical when we look at picking the vintage, and exactly what I was doing this morning and I'll be doing again this afternoon, is being out in the vineyard, tasting the fruit, deciding on the maturity for picking. That's critical. It's nice to have the figures, but in the end, it's what you're tasting, because it's what the customer ends up with. And getting the mature tannins, even if there's a greater density of tannin, you want those tannins to be mature. And I think that's what the 16 has really shown us, that you can have a really interesting season that produces a wine that's a little bit like a super version of the previous vintage, in terms of the fruit characters, in terms of the spice and everything else, and in terms of tannin. And I think that's what the 16 is. It's sort of like a wound up, the volume controlled a little bit in the structure and texture of the wine.
Thank you.
Alyssa, how did you see it?
I love the sage description, because it really does. It's part of that multi-layered, complex character that I saw, with a bit of licorice and also that eucalypt that Simon mentioned as well, just as a little breeze of it, not affecting the wine, but just as a really kind of added lift. The savoury characters again. I mean, I looking back through all my notes, I see the same sort of responses I've written about the savoury characters, the texture, the mid-palate weight, the juiciness. In particular with the Mount Edelstone, though, I think before I'd even sipped it, my mouth was watering. Just to smell the wine was so wonderful. It's like, it's just, yeah, I'm in awe of it.
Andrea, I should say.
Yeah, I will echo some of Melissa's comments, and Jenny's for that matter. But for me, there's a beautiful fragrance here with the Mount Edelstone, wonderful blackberries, but also some violet overtones, which is just so lovely to see in Shiraz. Silky, it's elegant. There's a lot of tannin, as Jenny's pointed out, a huge backbone. And I did write, it is still incredibly youthful, very much a wine for the cellar. So your comment, Stephen, about the 16s being a little bit more tightly coiled makes a lot of sense when you taste this wine.
No, I agree. I think that coiled up 15 versus 16, I think that's a really fantastic way to describe it, because the first smell of that Edelstone was almost fruity. I was kind of like, I don't know where this wine's going to go, but then it just had this lovely savoury tannic finish. It'll be such a massive crowd pleaser, that wine. It'll be a crowd pleaser now when, people open it up in famous Maryvale establishments. They'll enjoy it right now, but it's one of those big, generous wines which actually has the staying power behind it as well. I mean, talking about, the vintage and 16, and then we're moving to Hill of Roses, which I think I saw one of the really early vintages from someone showed me one, and they were quite light and ethereal kind of wines. Fascinating to see where that wine has gone. Jenny, we had a bit of a chat about it last night. Your thoughts?
I love this wine, but I've always loved this wine. it's the fragrance. And it's so lively at 5 years old. So it pulses with life for me. I love that. You just get it the minute that you smell it. But I have written here, and I have to read it out because I'm sure you get this all the time. Is it the power of suggestion? But are there dark rose notes amongst the violet and floral aromatics? I mean, maybe the mind is playing tricks with this wine, but if it is, it's not a bad trick to play, because I kept going back. I kept seeing roses and I thought, no, that's too obvious.
Didn't need the eyes ready.
Alluring aroma of turned earth, briar, black fruits, port wine, dark jelly, anise, baking spice. A balance of sweet Shiraz fruit intensity, a smidge of the savory, just, adding a bit of a different note there, a lifted aromatic prettiness and delicacy to this wine. Oak, tannins fully absorbed, a warm, embracing, but also substantial wine. I think that might be something that you can overlook. You just get so carried away with the emotion in this wine, but it is also a very substantial wine. I loved it.
Good. It's time to look.
How about you, Melissa?
I'm sorry, Angus.
For you, I mean, how did you see the wine? How did it play up here?
How can you follow Jenny? I mean, that's just perfect. That's it. And ditto. No, I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. The perfume, the fruit-driven berries, the orange peel, the fresh herb, like a bouquet of thyme and bay, and not sage like Mount Edelstone, but still that sort of fresh whiff of beautiful herbs. The power and the richness, the fine line of acidity. I just loved it as well. It was wonderful.
Mr. Simon?
That's Spanish.
Again, hard to follow and add something really different, but it is really the intensity and opulence of fruit there, which is just amazing. I've always found wines of Hill of Grace, Hill of Roses to offer that opulence and an intensity of fruit character. But then on top of that, what is extra to the wine is, of course, that perfume, that spice, the integration of oak. Again, just an amazing balance. And I wonder at what stage do you start including that into the Hill of Grace to give you more volume to sell? I mean, I couldn't fault you if you did.
It's a question I asked too.
Andrea?
Yes, I mean, I loved it as well. It's really expressive. It was very bright. There's a juiciness to this wine, lovely mulberry notes along with the cedary, a slight savory edge, but mostly about the beautiful, pure fruit expression. And for me, this was drinking really, really well right now, which was a surprise. So it seems to be the most open of the wines we tasted yesterday. But I think it still has tremendous potential.
For me, it had, and we don't need to, allude to famous French regions or anything like that, but it had a Côte Rôtie prettiness to it. This particular wine, I thought there was like a ripe vintage, because there was sweet fruit there, but at the same time there was this just beautiful, ethereal, spicy, meaty, floral, and that kind of lighter, slightly lighter palate than I think the Hill of Grace has. That's where it sent me. I mean, I think the question is, yes, obviously, this wine will end up in, potentially will end up in Hill of Grace. So that wine was so beautiful as a little single vineyard piece. I think there's a stronger argument for potentially keeping it as a separate entity. I'm sure that's not in your plans, but I just think that wine was such a strong, unique, engage, and you can hear what all our words, we're pretty much all saying the same thing. Was such a unique, engaging wine. We all loved it, clearly.
Yes, I don't think Prue would have anticipated, looking back when she started doing the selection of the grandfathers, her mass selection back in '86, that we'd be talking about the wine off that little nursery patch that she planted the same way as we are now. It's really quite interesting because this was a project really to preserve and protect the genetics of the old grandfathers and keep them. So the selection process was based on her training at Geisenheim, and it's been a really valuable exercise for us. And to see those baby vines sort of growing up, getting older and older, and from 2001 up to now, we've seen such a change in this level from the baby pretty confectionery Shiraz to a serious Shiraz. And I love the comment that you say, could you consider putting out in Hill of Grace? Because when we line them up, they're getting harder and harder now to say that Hill of Roses should stay out. But the vines are only, the vines are planted in 89, so they're only just over 30 years old, so they're still babies. They don't turn old vines until they're 35, according to the Brassicetta, Jenny, do they? So they've got a few more years to say Hill of Roses. But I must also say that I think this is probably one of the most floral Hill of Roses we've ever made. And the comment about the roses is rather ironic because that was the name of the family at the post office, the Rosenzweig family, Rose Twig family. And to think that one day the wine would actually
I tried to fight it. I fought it, I thought, no, there are roses in that one.
Yeah, I've still got a red rose, I think, in the garden. I'm going to run out and get it.
I mean,
that rose musk, isn't it? It's almost part of the Hill of Grace kitchen spice.
It's a very pretty version of the, it's one of the prettiest versions I think we've made of the vineyard. So yeah, we're delighted. And it's interesting to talk about the Hill of Grace after this because you're in the same vineyard and you've got the difference in vine age and how that plays out in the structure and texture of the wine.
Absolutely. Jenny Port, Hill of Grace, 2016. Where will it sit as a vintage?
It's a slow one, isn't it? It's like slow food, slow movie, slow, travel. It's quiet. I found this, and I taste wines the way consumers do. So I just opened the bottle, I poured it in the glass. So all my notes are based on that. I found it a quiet start. And in fact, I've written towards the end, this is a wine that urges you to think about it. It's not going to deliver everything on a plate to you. You are going to have to put something into this wine, into the process of tasting, thinking about it. And I found this, it's quite a deep kind of wine from that point of view. Slow start, build slowly, black plum, preserved fig, blackberry, briar, earth, leather, cola. Seamless and deep concentration of fruit on the palate. It's quite subtle again, not forward in the least. It's dark, intriguing and harmonious. Tannins are fine and a touch savory, tight and long. Oak is a picture of integration, but that goes without saying. Fruit is intense, exploring added notes of aniseed, bitter chocolate, and there's more on the palate. So sorry to read it, but there's a lot happening in this wine to remember. So yeah, I just thought, a bit like the Mount Edelstone is not coming out and saying, here I am, for me at least. It really wants you to think about it, to age it further. And I found them almost in a similar kind of frame of mind. So from that point of view, Hill of Grace shares similar characteristics I found to the Mount Edelstone. It remains tight-lipped, structured and firm for the present, but definitely won't remain quite that tight-lipped, firm and so on for the future.
Interesting in relation to that 15 vintage too. The 15 vintage was more open, wasn't it? When we tried it a year ago, like it already was showing sage and Chinese 5-spice, and it already was there. This is like long and strong were the two adjectives that I kind of thought of this wine. It was like not muscular, but just like a marathon runner kind of thing. The power was there, the length was unbelievable, but still just young and tight and focused and delicious. Andrea?
Well, this was the first one I tasted when I arrived at Angus's house. I said. Also because I actually really wanted to devote a very fresh palate to this wine. I figured there was going to be a lot to say and to discover, and certainly there is. So like all the great fine wines of the world, this has lovely layers, both in the fragrance and on the palate as well. Those mulberries, sage, leafiness. The tannins were quite silky, but then underlying that, there's a powerful carriage. There's a real structure there. For me, this is a wine of great poise, and you immediately see that. If I had tasted it blind, it would have stood out because of that poise, because of the elegance and the structure. Still incredibly tightly coiled and youthful for a 16, but because that's the caliber of the wine, it's meant to be cellared and enjoyed with some maturity. It's going to really reward that. So I was really impressed.
Simon, I can see this at Cafe Sydney on the list.
Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt. I said before, at what stage do you include Hill of Roses into Hill of Grace? When you taste Hill of Roses, knowing its history, knowing what the wine is, and then you taste Hill of Grace alongside that, and very few opportunities where you can see a Hill of Roses versus a Hill of Grace in reality because of the cost of these things. But there's always that moment when you first smell a Hill of Grace, which just you get excited and you can't wait then to taste it. And so there are very few wines and occasions where the first thing that comes out of my mouth is just wow. And the 16 did it for me, and it does it in a way which exceeds the 2015. Like we were just talking about the Edelston 16 and that extra layer of tannin. I really enjoy that extra layer of tannin. There's a vinous quality to this which just is a step above for me. For me, it's like comparing, say, 09 and 2010 or 1990 and 91. For me, very often, 91 is a better wine than 90. 16 for me will probably remain my favourite in comparison to, say, 15. But please, that's not taking anything away from 1990 or 2015 in any way, shape or form. It's just that absolute personal preference. For me, it also evokes this sort of sense of what Shiraz is all about. It draws back memories to me when my mum used to take me into what was called the Continental Deli when I was a real, of a single digits age. And you have this amazing smell when you walk into some of these places, from all the cured meats, everything that's hanging on the walls, the type of place that only the wogs used to go to, if I could say that.
People of Mediterranean origin.
I'll let you edit that out.
Cut.
And then you have that overlay of not only all of that sort of sensory explosion, but you have that immense density and opulence of fruit character and intensity. And then that tannin structure, which just gives their wine that immense length. And, I think it's just about a perfect expression of Hill of Grace as I could imagine tasting. And, when a wine is so good, all I want to do is drink it. And congratulations.
Lovely. And Melissa, for you.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, to be privileged to be tasting these wines and the Hill of Grace in particular, the importance of it in the Australian and global wine market as family-owned, single vineyard, the love and care that's taken in the vineyard all the way through, and to have the wine in the glasses so drinkable now. I mean, there's no doubt that in 25 and 30 years, the wine will be absolutely delicious, but to be able to actually just think yum when you taste the wine. And that was the thing. I've just got delicious and intense and ripe and delicious. And I've written it several times there. And of course it's a baby. of course, but it's just so wonderful, and it's just the history in the glass. To have the feeling so proud to have that as an Australian wine. You know, it's such an iconic wine, but it has so much more to it because of the history in your family and because of the biodynamic life that it has, and for the future generations. You know, it really is. It's just amazing. I feel very privileged to have been able to taste it yesterday. Thank you.
I think, you know, I think that is a beautiful place to end off, Melissa. I think, you know, that beautifully complete wine, and it was just, and I think all the great wines we've ever had, they're beautiful young and they're beautiful old. They already show themselves at a young age. They might have structure, but it all fits together. And I think that wine was just complete. It was long, it was strong, and it was complete, and it was fantastic. And absolutely, Stephen and Prue, you know, real pleasure, and, you know, very rare pleasure to look at those wines. So thank you very much for sharing them with us.
That's great.
And thank you. And
I just like to say that aren't we lucky in Australia that we've got such great wines coming from our old vineyards?
Yes.
I don't know whether anybody listened to the Old Vine conference the other night, early morning for us, but it seemed like there was a plea to save old vineyards. And yet here in Australia, we really valuing them.
Yeah.
I was pretty proud of that.
And I think wines like this make the argument strongly, don't they? They make, I think we all know there are some old vine wines that maybe aren't looked after potentially as they could be in the winery, as well as the vines themselves. And I think these wines are a beautiful, you know, the whole lot of them, essentially, especially Edelstein and Hill of Grace, are a beautiful display and an example of what old wines can do.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Stephen and Prue, yes, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for your work. We will let you get back to the vineyards now and go and enjoy walking through. We're not jealous at all. In Sydney and Melbourne, we're not jealous at all. We'd rather be stuck in our houses. But I'd really also like to think, obviously, you know, the other people here, Andrew Pritzker, Master of Wine, Jenny Port, Simon Kirkovich, and Melissa Moore. Beautiful words. Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for your time.